Hi, this is David Gornoski, host of A Neighbor's Choice and Things Hidden podcast, as well as some of our other programs like Science and You with our chief science advisor, Dr. Yu, and our seed oil survival series that we continue to have great fun unpacking the truth of nutrition. I wanted to give you a quick little message saying we appreciate all the support that we get from our monthly contributors and our one-time donation supporters, and we'd encourage all of you to go to our website, aneighborschoice.com, click on contribute, and make a monthly pledge today, whether it's $1, $5, 15, 20, 50, whatever you want to do. Doesn't matter. Just be a part of building this new media project that we've developed to empower and inform, to inspire, to kickstart a scientific renaissance, an anthropological breakthrough and reformation in the church. All these things are possible with your support right now. So make that commitment today and help us keep doing the productions that we have. Thank you. But today we have another fun conversation for you, and it's a returning guest, someone who I enjoyed our last conversation so much I said we got to have him on because I saw a thread that he did on Twitter recently, and I thought, this is really, a provocative thought we need to unpack for our audience. Auron MacIntyre, how you doing, sir?
Doing well. Thanks for having me again.
Very good. So your thread, I guess I can kind of set it up here. It's reference to this group, the Los Angeles Dodgers invited. It's been getting a lot of attention right now. This group that's called the Sisters of the Eternal Happiness or whatever. What's the name of their group called? Eternal.
I'm trying to remember now. It's something like
perpetual bliss, perpetual something. So he says, for a long time, progressives made great strides by transferring conflicts of moral vision out of the realm of the sacred and into the realm of the scientific. By making things cold, clinical, rational, and secular, the left were able to deconstruct load-bearing social norms. Can you unpack? Let's just go line by line. I like this.
Sure. So the Dodgers invited and then uninvited and then re-invited this group. And, they're sitting there doing like strip shows based on the crucifixion, right?
Yeah, just for our audience sake, there's a Citizen Free Press tweet that you've screenshotted in this thread. And you can check it out where it's got people on a stripping pole and a crucifix, and it looks pretty horrible. But okay, go ahead.
Yeah, but that context is important because a lot of people are looking at this stuff and they're saying, why is it like this, right? We were told that religion was old, that religion was useless, that religion was primitive. It's a fairy story for children, right? And so we were told that what had happened was we were advanced people. We had moved beyond all of these things. We had transferred all of these questions that were once been in the realm of the sacred. They had belonged to the metaphysical. They've been questions of philosophy and religion. And we were told that now science would be able to kind of handle all of this stuff, that it would be able to answer all of these questions now because we had these fact, reason, evidence-based, standards by which we could judge everything. It was all objective. It was all very scientific. And we didn't need to appeal to any of this kind of old mumbo jumbo anymore. But it's very clear that by transferring a lot of these things into the realm of the scientific, we were able to remove a lot of kind of the natural defenses against it, a lot of the natural spiritual defenses that I think are built into humans against a lot of these atrocities. And by making these things, about biology or science or psychology, instead of, acknowledging that there is a spiritual aspect to life and that these issues do appeal directly to the spiritual, evil was able to advance because people did not notice that they had been stripped of these natural mechanisms of defense.
Right. You go on to say, it's hard to sell the redefinition of marriage in a religious context, but if you can shift the discussion of sexuality to the realm of biological determinism, then it becomes easy to advance your political ideology. So that kind of goes to what you're saying there, that there's this redefinition of marriage that can't be done on terms of a value system of appeal to a transcendent order.
Mm-hmm.
It has to be done on a kind of, look, this is just the brass tacks of this. I'm sorry, this is just the facts here. We're just trying to get reality, right?
Right. Yeah. If marriage is something sacred, if marriage is something that is defined by, something that is beyond the ability of men to manipulate, then you can't just go ahead and change its definition at will. You can't just reorder society and what has been a natural institution and hierarchy throughout all of human civilization. But if you can turn it into something that is purely biological, well, now we can control the biological, right? Now we have mastered this. We have become as gods when it comes to this. And so if we can place it into this realm, then it is ours to rearrange at will. And again, like you're saying, if it's just about the nuts and bolts, well, since we are able to rearrange nuts and bolts as we wish, all we have to do is move it into that realm, and all of a sudden we have power over it.
Yeah, literally rearranging nuts and bolts in real time.
Yeah. Right.
It doesn't matter. You go on to say, this is like you're doing commentary on your own words. I like this. This is good. But it's just the way I like to do it. This is fun. It doesn't matter if the left immediately abandons that biological determinism the minute it makes contact with any other social issue. They never really cared about the science. They just cared about the political victory it could deliver. So there's that word, the science, that's been used in recent terms for other things. But what was the political victory it delivered? You know, that because it's true, they went from, look, I was born this way to no, there is no intrinsic born status. It's whatever, your spirit can defy whatever you're born with. That's now become kind of like a detachment. I call it like a pseudo Gnosticism. It's still grounded in materialism. And it's kind of what you're getting at, that they use this scientific materialism as the foundation for the worldview, but ultimately now they're kind of detaching from it into this kind of fake Gnosticism where you can kind of recreate humanity in your own image based on your mental state or whatever, right? So how did they see this as a political victory to push for, like this changing of marriage?
Well, when you have used biological determinism as a wedge to justify this behavior, you immediately have to retreat from it because much of what the left believes in is not acknowledging biological reality. Of course, we know men can't become women. That marriage is not. It's between a man and a woman. These things are built in. So you need to flee that biological reality that like men are stronger than women in the face of your own belief system. But it did achieve the political victory, and the political victory for them is the normalization of LGBTQ lifestyles. And they know this is a political victory for them because they understand this as a monolithic voting bloc in their favor. Many people will notice that the left is very keen on allowing as many illegal immigrants into the country as possible because they know that statistically speaking, over time, that shifts the electorate in their direction. Well, the same is true of the queering of America. By encouraging this lifestyle, they guarantee a larger and larger segment of the population is locked into a lifestyle whose pattern of voting is consistently to the left or progressives. So by making sure that, and we've seen this already, that there's been an explosion of this identification in things like high school, where as many as a quarter or more of students are now identifying in this lifestyle. Those people are becoming dedicated progressive voters. They have an identity, manufactured or organic, that binds them to a voting pattern that will secure the left electoral victories for a long time. So it is not only a cultural victory, it is also a political victory.
Yeah, I always describe the neo-Darwinism and materialism for the left as like this savage Rottweiler that they would turn loose onto any edifice of Christianity or anything like that, and then it's like a rabid Rottweiler. And the moment they don't need it, they just shoot it, all right, we're done with that. Let's go back to what we wanted to, They never really were really like they always bring out the neo-Darwinism and materialism to justify their sexual revolution. That's really where the core of Darwinism comes in for them, like really, they don't like Darwinism to really touch a lot of other stuff. Like you said, even the gender thing that kind of goes against that kind of neo-Darwinism materialistic framework. But they like it when it comes to discrediting and creating a disenchantment with the idea of the universe having like divinity, infused in it, with order and purpose and direction, right? Those are things that they want to strip away first in the mind of the person so that they can then, start to implant a new, a kind of Christianity divorced of God, divorced of limits to behavior, to be able to shape humans in a new religion, right? Sounds like kind of
Yeah, it's entirely a weapon of political utility. It's abandoned them, like you said, they just shoot it the minute they don't need it anymore. Once its job is done, it needs to be discarded, because if you continually observe natural hierarchies, I forget the which scientist the quote's from, but it's like, your first gulp of natural science will make you an atheist, but God is sitting at the bottom of that glass, and that, it's the same thing. You can say, oh well, I look at this piece of science and it demystifies something for me, but the bottom of that are natural hierarchies created by something beyond you. And if you continue to observe it long enough, you'll discover those. So they can only use it as long as it's good for the dismantling. They don't want you to actually come to the conclusions that it eventually actually produces.
You go on to say in this same thread, the same applies to abortion or transing kids. If children are a sacred gift, then that stuff is hard to sell. But you can justify all kinds of horrific acts if children are just clumps of cells or meat, Legos, to be rearranged for the social clout of their narcissistic parents. Secularizing evil allowed it to advance relentlessly without triggering the moral alarms, the mechanisms of terror or disgust that naturally manifest with those who are still in touch with the metaphysical side of life. Rearrange for the social clout of their narcissistic parents. Do you think narcissism is the root of what this thing, or is that just one aspect of it?
It's a rhetorical flourish. I think it's an aspect of it, but it's not the entirety of it. I mean, these parents often believe that they're doing what's right. That humans are narrative creatures, and they do not just completely interact with facts. They set themselves inside. Their being, is defined by the narratives that kind of inform and give them the way to kind of filter different aspects of life. And a lot of these people are being told that, children need to be put on puberty blockers until they can determine their own gender, this kind of stuff. And they believe it. Like, don't get me wrong. There are people who are cynical. There are people who do it for power. There are people who realize that it gives them, some of the things that they want. They make profit or something off of it. But don't lie to yourself. These people are true believers. At the end of the day, they buy into this idea that their children need to be given this, and they know that putting their children through this process accords them status, and it accords them, basically makes them look holy in front of their friends, and that's what they want.
Why do they want to look holy in front of their friends?
We all do. That's the most natural and one of the most natural impulses. We all want honor. We all want status.
But did Jesus want to do that? I don't know.
No, well, I mean, obviously, Jesus is a little different than your average human, right? That's kind of the whole point. But as humans, we want to put glory on ourselves, right? And we want to take God's place. We want status inside of that. Even the disciples, right? Who's going to sit at the right hand? We're always arguing over that kind of position. And so it's the most natural thing in the world, even if it's naturally sinful, for people to seek this status. And when your status game is played inside of this inverted hierarchy, inside of this deeply unnatural and evil hierarchy, then you seek ascension inside it. You seek status inside it by glorifying yourself, by being seen as holy by the dictates of that particular faith.
And by evil, you're appealing to a Christian metaphysical standard, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Going on to this, I don't know if I read this part yet, but by stripping people of metaphysical framework with which to process the spiritual nature of existence, progressives disarm the most powerful defense against their war on the good, the beautiful, and the true. And he said that's why people are so surprised to see stuff like this breaking through. This wasn't supposed to be real. Religion is dumb and outdated, right? Just some fairy stories for children. But of course it isn't. The spiritual is real and can't be erased. So again, it's this idea of the return of religion. And this has been talked about in academic circles for some time, right? This return of religion, the return of theology, and having to account for these things again. How does this fit into the whole Nietzschean thing that God is dead? You know, I mean, how do you see this?
Well, there's a guy, I don't know if you're familiar with Alexander Dugin.
Yeah.
And in his book, The Fourth Political Theory, he made, I think, which is a really excellent point, which is in the postmodern era, the question is not struggling with, is God dead? That was the question of the modern era. For most people, the question then becomes, who's dead? Because they don't even know God anymore. They no longer truly understand the spiritual. And so I think we're beyond this point. I think he's right to a large extent that, a lot of people spent the modern era, spent modernity struggling through the idea of, is God dead and what does that mean for our society? But now it's become so separated from the experience of the spiritual and contact with the metaphysical that most people are re-encountering this for the first time. And that means that there's a possibility of re-enchantment for the world. But of course, re-enchantment of the world doesn't necessarily mean for the best, right? There could be re-enchantment of the world seeking evil, seeking perverse ends, seeking things that are kind of outside of God's design. Just because we make contact with the spiritual doesn't mean we're always making contact with that which is good. And so I think that a lot of people are seeing these things break back through. They're seeing a lot of the people on the progressive side who are supposed to be all about science and logic re-embracing a lot of this stuff. And they are surprised to see the spiritual come entering into a place that was supposed to be all about reason and logic, leaving all this religion behind. They're shocked to see it again.
So, but what, the common, maybe often the common response to this would be, look, we're making these, like these appeals to Satanism, like they did in these music events. Or I don't remember the name of the artist that was trying to dress up as the devil or whatever. But that, look, we're just making a point, right? We don't really believe in this stuff. We're saying these were symbols that have been used to otherize our people, to otherize our community within the Christian framework of hate or whatever. And so what we are doing is we're reclaiming those symbols, and we're saying, look, if you're going to continually make us the boogeyman, which is your Satan figure, then we're going to embrace it, because you can't beat us with your attempts to otherize us and to isolate us and to scapegoat us. And so how would you respond to that? That it's not a true return to some kind of transcendent belief in these things, but it's just, they're just taking the sandbox of Christianity and they're repurposing it to make a point and to drive the right nuts.
So the thing about Satanism is there is no such thing as ironic Satanism. It's all just Satanism. If you're embracing it ironically or not, it doesn't really matter. The devil doesn't really care about your whether your belief is holy and true and pure. Those are aspects that are not his. Those are not his things. The subversion of things belongs to him. And so if you do these things as an act of subversion, you're already participating in the archetype, whether you take it directly seriously or not. And of course, as we know, once you start acting in something, once you start embodying a belief, you eventually come to actually hold it, whether you initially meant to or not. Yeah, I'm sure there are a lot of these people who are saying, oh, I'm just, subverting this. I'm just taking these symbols and turning it upside down. But to what end? These people are already in charge. These people are already culturally ascendant. They are already the ones who are victorious, standing on top of the culture. They're not subverting anything. They're simply establishing what they think should actually be in charge. There's no mistake that all of these groups, be they, child transition groups or, this stuff, keep embracing the Church of Satan. It's just, sorry, like you can pretend it's irony all you want, but at some point, when they tell you who they are, probably could just believe them.
Right. So the question is then, so what's the catacon to bind up this evil? That's kind of where you go if you're in a religious framework, right? What's going to bind up the lawlessness? I think your answer would be the Constitution, right?
What do you mean? I'm sorry.
The
Constitution would stop evil? No, I don't think it would do that.
I'm just teasing you. Okay. So I was looking at, you're not, that's what you're a constitutionalist, aren't you? Isn't that what,
I am not. No, in no way, shape, or form. Yeah. For people who aren't aware, I am skeptical of those who think that just the Constitution itself or return to kind of formal restrictions on power, these kind of things, is sufficient. There are many people throughout history. I usually draw from Joseph de Maistre, but this point has been made over and over again by many, that laws and constitutions are simply reflections of the beliefs and folkways of the people who form them, who write them. And so a constitution can really only have the force in which it kind of reinforces the culture and the beliefs and the attitudes and the traditions of kind of the people who are embodying it. And so if you're hoping that a piece of paper in and of itself kind of rights your ship, then you don't understand the level at which this conflict is taking place. This is not a legal dispute, and it's not one that will be solved simply by the renegotiation of a social contract.
But you would say that perhaps constitutionalism, as our system is designed with checks and balances, has probably slowed some of this impulse towards lawlessness. Would you not say that? Maybe, that's kind of, I mean, it's true that the founding fathers in America was founded with a revolutionary fervor, right?
Right.
And so, of course, if you're founded on revolution, eventually that revolution is going to continue and it's going to swallow you up in the original framework of that revolutionary spirit, right? That revolt.
Yeah, I mean, as you and I were talking about before we got even on here, of course, the Constitution is not the founding document of the United States. It's not actually what came out of the revolution. The revolutionary document is the Articles of Confederation.
Right. The Constitution was the coup against it.
Yeah, once the bankers figured out that they couldn't keep taking the farms from people to pay off their debts, and they started drowning the tax collectors, you got Shays' Rebellion. The federal government couldn't stop Shays' Rebellion, and so these war veterans who had just got done fighting the British over taxes said, well, we'll just fight the American government over taxes too. And the government couldn't stop them. They didn't have the ability to coordinate a force that could actually put it down. And they said, well, if we can't do this, then we can't run a country. And so they actually consolidated power under the Constitution. It's a reactionary centralization of power, not a separation thereof.
Right. Now, do you have an opinion? Do you think that was a good move to go from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution, or, are you agnostic about that or something?
So it's a difficult thing, and this is what was acknowledged during the actual Constitution. The Articles of Confederation is a document that's meant to govern 13 separate countries that work together every once in a while when they need to. It was not a document designed to forge a strong country that could eventually create an empire. The Constitution in some ways was. I don't think that maybe Hamilton, Madison, and Jay had a full global empire in mind, but they're certainly forging a document for a nation that was unified under one government and had the ability to expand and become a world power. And so if your goal is to create a world power that can become an empire, then yeah, you probably need the Constitution. The Constitution is probably a positive thing for you. If you think the United States should have continued to exist as 13 separate countries that from time to time work together, then no. And all of the things that the Anti-Federalists warned against happened under the Constitution. But there's also a deeper question there about the metaphysics of power. And I don't know if we want to sidetrack this whole episode with going in with. Well,
we've started with metaphysics. Let's go further with it then.
Okay, so power always seeks to centralize. That's the natural desire of power. It always.
What is power? First of all, just when you're using it in this context.
Political power is the ability of a man to move a man. It's the ability of one man to say to the other, "You move," and he does. And power always wants to accrue more because the centralization of power always allows the utility of wielding it with greater force, at greater strength. It's something that becomes exponentially powerful as it gathers more into itself. And so power is also an arms race. If France creates the levée en masse and can bring an entire nation of men to arms under mass-produced arms, then the people around them have to figure out a way to do the same thing, or they'll simply be ruled by France. So if sovereign nations want to be sovereign, they must keep pace with the power wielded by other states around them, or they'll lose. And so not only does power want to centralize, it also must do so in order for those who wield it to continue to maintain sovereignty. And so we could say that the United States should have stayed 13 independent nations. And my personal desire would that be the case. But would it have succeeded? Would it have survived? Would it have not been torn apart by greater empires who would have picked these nations apart piece by piece and absorbed them? It seems likely that they would have. I mean, that's how colonization worked throughout most of the world at the same way. And so it's really hard to say, should it have or should it wouldn't? The point is it did, and it would have, and it seems inescapable to some extent that it would. And so that's kind of, I think, the question that has to be answered.
What about like the whole Switzerland model, that you can be a small little plucky, prickly little independent little republics, and everybody's got a gun, and everybody, you stay neutral, and Hitler doesn't want to go into Switzerland and all these different things. Switzerland stays relatively neutral through these different events in history, and small, but it's effective. It's like a little hedgehog or whatever, so like, some people have imagined America in its littleness being kind of like in that spirit, and being a neutral nation, an example of liberty, armed to the teeth, rich, natural resources, innovative, and you don't want to mess with them, even if they're like loosely affiliated at the central level.
I can't say that I'm an authority on Switzerland, but I would wonder if Switzerland truly rules itself. Is it really not subject to the culture of the larger empires around it? Is it really not subject to the financial powers wielded by those around it? You're right that in the military sense, no one's physically invading Switzerland. But I wonder at the end of the day if the people of Switzerland really have self-determination over their cultures, their folkways, their practices. There are many places you could say in the world that are independent, that are not owned by another empire, but they follow in suit. I mean, Canada is not technically owned by the United States, but in many ways it's entirely designed to be to have a particular relationship to the United States, right? The culture is almost we're the nicer United States. We're the more progressive United States. In many ways,
we're so nice that we want to do euthanasia for children now. My God.
Well, that's the thing, right? Though is places like that in Australia tend to actually accelerate many of the progressive things that are developed in the United States that coalesce around that. So those nations are not technically under the rule of the United States, but are they functionally satrapies of the United States in that they really accelerate and pursue the things that progressives push out of the United States culture? Again, it's very difficult because as our world becomes more connected, even if you have a technical political boundary making you sovereign, this culture and the connectivity of the capitalism that flows into your nation can be just as much an invasion as the actual physical military invasion. Look at the opening of Japan and China with gunboat diplomacy, right? These are nations that did not want to westernize, but they didn't have the choice, because at the end of the day, the people who westernized had the bigger guns. Mm-hmm. And so the culture was forced in. The acceleration, technological acceleration was forced into the country, because to deny it meant obliteration.
So is your answer, I mean, I saw you shared an excerpt from a Curtis Yarvin article about the Constitution, saying we got to get past this idea that it's an exile, right? You're saying that has to be totally done away with. He kind of calls for a kind of strong, FDR type kingly president to take power. Is that kind of what you see as the road to success for those who, value the values that you share?
It's difficult. I think every nation is different, and I think their governments will reflect those nations. I think that our founding fathers were pretty clear about the type of nation that our Constitution could govern, right? It was made for a moral people. It was made for a Christian people. It was made for a people who could follow the Ten Commandments, were virtuous. And it was not made for anyone else. Those very specifically the words of our founding fathers. And I guess we have to ask ourselves, are we that nation? Are we those people? Are we the people for whom the Constitution was designed? And if the answer is no, then can we be governed by the same system of government? Because the people who designed it told us we couldn't. And so you have to, that's kind of the things I encourage people who see themselves as conservatives or, to think about. If you venerate the words of the founding fathers, well, listen to them. What did they say about where you are? And how could you be governed in that scenario? I think that you will see a strong man, because that's how the cycles of history work. Because when oligarchies are falling apart like ours are, they usually are, kind of corrected in this way. They're kind of brought back by this way. But I don't know if it'll be at the national level. We might see things atrophy to the point where we're closer to an Articles of Confederation, where the different regions simply ignore a federal government, a central government that cannot compel them, that does not have the competency and authority to kind of continue to govern the entire empire. And at that point, we might see regionalism, return. And those different regions might have different approaches. One might have more of a monarchical executive. One might come closer to a more classical republic, the way that we've seen others. But I think either way, the thing to remember is that it's not just about systems. It's not just about rearranging the political science until you get it right. It's that the people, that those the ruling systems are a reflection of the people. And until the character of the people change, the system will reflect, what they desire or what they compel it to.
So you're not suggesting that a strongman figure could whip up the character of the people to be good?
I would say
that's not the role of that figure in your imagination, right?
Well, they could lead through an example. There is a possibility. The Bible again is not unclear that the people often prospered when the king honored God and led them towards God, and they started falling away and following idols when the king started erecting them. Solomon at the end of his days starts erecting idols to other gods, right? He get and the people kind of suffer in the meantime. And so I think there's a role of leadership that the leader could play in that area, but I wouldn't say that is in and of itself enough. That might be how God decides to use a leader, but I don't think that that's the only avenue to which people can reacquire virtue. So
the
I
Old
think
Testament's pretty skeptical of kings. It's like, please don't do that. God's like, I don't want you to do that. That's not going to work well. It's going to tax you 10%. It's exorbitant. Here we are today. What, 60%?
Yeah.
With inflation, local, you're spending 60% of every year as an indentured servant to pay for local, state, federal, and inflation tax. I mean, we far surpassed the curse that was warned about with bringing on a king in Samuel, right?
Yeah, but I think that's really, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's really a wider. It's not the king specifically. It's not that people embraced monarchy after the judges. It's that the people no longer trusted God to govern them, right? And they wanted a more formal earthly power. And so I don't know that republics or democracies are any closer to God's vision for the formation of government than a king is. I think the problem was that Israel rejected God as their sovereign and instead wanted a formal earthly.
That's an interesting
sovereign.
question, but again, I'm not an expert on that text either, but it seems to indicate that kind of the concept of demanding a king was akin to rejecting trusting God for the provision of law and adjudication of what's right and wrong. You know what I mean? Through judge, like kind of a decentralized tribal judge system was more which ancient Ireland had that for a long time. That seemed to be pretty successful.
Well, and this is, again, this is something that we see throughout history. If you look at the history of Rome, the gens, the patrician families, wielded much larger power than the centralized government, even when the centralized government was king, right? Because the king had to give deference to the patriarchs, the heads of families. And so if you had to judge someone, you didn't take them to the authority of the king first. He was first judged inside the authority of the family. And the king would not dare to to violate the authority of the patriarch inside that family. And so the king's was only a judge when it was across these things, right? When it was supra, above these subsidiarities. And so I think that the correct way is, as you are saying, to have these subsidiarities, to have these judges and authorities and hierarchies closer to, and to have them based on something deep and natural, like the authority of the family, the authority of the church. But I don't think that the presence of a monarch themselves is, again, the violation of that principle. I think that it can be used in a role to create a system that is good. But I think that whether you give all of your power to a monarchy or to a communist party or to a oligarchy, like the theocratic oligarchy that currently rules our nation in the guise of political wokeness, no matter what you wield that power to, when you give the total power to the central authority, that's kind of when you're in trouble. And so I'm not sure the king of the figure of the king is so much the worry as the centralization of all power under that one total state.
But it tends to be effective in the earthly sense of strongmen tend to be people who accumulate and centralize power because of that cult of personality of their charisma and so forth. And
I think the United States government, which has no monarch, is way more powerful than almost every monarch throughout history. I think that the Republic of France wielded way more power than most of the monarchs throughout history.
Hans Hermann Hoppe makes a similar argument about the transition from monarchy to public government.
Because we're both working off of Bertrand de Juvenal. Hoppe is great because he's working from the metaphysics of power he's using is that of Bertrand de Juvenal, to which I also subscribe. So we might have different conclusions about some of but we're both acknowledging the same truths about power.
And see, I keep going back to, and that's what I told Curtis Yarvin when we talked a few times, is that I just don't see how that fits in with kind of like the Christian progressive undermining of strong structures in history, and that just kind of ties back to where we started off and kind of bringing it back home to this thread you made, but I thought was very, poignant to point out that they use materialism. They always appeal to scientism whenever they want to shut you down, but it's really just power, and it's really power in the service of some kind of transcendence, right? And yet Jesus says, my power is made perfect in weakness. And I don't think that's just something you can truncate into your private personal life. I think he's talking about a kind of civic vision that's going to unfold in history by countries that are baptized in meaning, saturated with his spirit. And the paraclete there means the defense attorney. What are we defending? We're defending those who are vulnerable. We're defending those who are trampled down by the kings of the earth, who rage in vain because they can't keep the trampling going as easy and efficient as it was prior to the arrival of the King of Jesus, the kingship of Jesus, kingdom of Jesus. So with that said, how do you get through that? I mean, because I'm just observing it kind of neutrally on this level of just like, okay, there's a model for how you're kind of suggesting a strong central king, or not necessarily central. You did say it could be small little groups.
So to clarify,
how does I get through that?
Well, I think the thing is having an effective executive whose powers are large in the areas in which they should be wielded, but that area is very narrow. But to your larger question, how do you kind of get to that? Well, I look at Constantine and Charles Martel and Charlemagne, right? Would we have a Christendom without these people? But were they weak? Were they people who got rid of power, dispersed it, denied it? Or are they people who wielded it to further Christendom, to protect and make sure that it wasn't consumed by, say, Muslim invasion? Can my completely weak, subservient Christian government defend me against a large Muslim invasion and destruction of Europe? Those are things that matter. We can't just ignore those things. I think that Christ's words are incredibly important, of course, and they are central to our understanding of many things. But I don't think that it would have been hard for almost any Christian to understand that nations need to be able to defend themselves, and that nations need to be able to have effective leadership, and that nations need to be able to reinforce a godly culture that will allow them to grow. And if they can't do that because they don't have the effective tools of the state to do that, then that is as much of a problem as centralizing too much power in those tools and having them turned against you. Human kingdoms are not meant to last. They are not eternal in the way that God's kingdom is. And so nothing we build temporally, politically, will ever be eternal, nor should it. That is immunizing the eschaton, right? But we want to build things that are as effective at bringing, a good life through, kind of a knowledge of Christ and a reflection of what he wants for society to a people who are ruled.
Yeah.
And I don't know that republics do that any more naturally than kings do.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting that's the only option, republicanism versus monarchy, but I'm just trying to figure out how. I've concluded that basically the nations are raging in vain because the social ordering mechanism, the scapegoat mechanism that they use to bind societies together, is getting further and further undermined by the gospel saturating the world. And even though we get pale ripoffs of the gospel with what we see today in liberal, hegemonic conversation, it still has enough of the real thing that the gospel is able to undermine any project that wants to create order by even aping the Christian aesthetic for victims. It still undermines strong attacks strong impositions of force. It's still going to undermine it by waking up the public to further opportunities for creating alternatives to scapegoating violence. For example, you can't go back to older forms of imposition of force, right? You can't go back to certain types of punishments and public shamings and things like that. Like those things have been completely undermined. People always say, I want to be tough on the war on drugs. And I'm like, okay, well, like the level of violence you would have to do to get someone to like really get scared about selling drugs is a level of violence that our society wouldn't want to go back to in terms of like public, executions, things like that. You're not going to go back to that.
I'm less sure that's a progress. I'm less sure that's moral progress than you. I think that's a lack of moral conviction that you would be able to work for the good of your nation by using corporal punishment when appropriate to let people know that this is not allowed because this destroys societies, destroys families. I don't think that watching people die of fentanyl or locking them up for 10 years is any kinder than corporal punishment. I really don't. That's
what I'm saying. I'm saying like the level of I'm tough on war on drugs now is just longer sentences where they get 3 square meals, they get to have a degree and so forth.
But that's because we're too weak to do what needs to be done.
But how would you get that strength back? Is what I'm saying,
Sure. Well, I mean, that people will eventually look for it. What's the country? Is it Nicaragua that just had the president come in and he just ended up, surrounding these gangs and
El Salvador, right?
El Salvador. You're right. Yeah, that's the one. Now I don't know deeply about that, and I don't want to endorse any particular model that I'm not super familiar with. But at some point, people will look for someone who can simply make the violence stop. How many of your family members do you need to watch lose hope and die to fentanyl before you're like, okay, whoever stops this, they're my guy, right? And that's not always a good thing, right? That's always a dangerous situation because, evil people can ascend to power just as often as good
That's
people
how
in that
usually
scenario.
Satan works, is he takes something that's a legitimate, like moral failing, and he twists it into a half truth or something to distort a justification for a blowback that ends up creating more long-term damage, right?
It could be,
And
but
yeah,
but that's also how you get restorations.
yeah.
That's also when people say, I am willing to turn away from this,
Mhm.
even though I've been told that, I don't need to believe in this anymore, that this is outdated, that this is backwards. When people recognize that these things were done for a reason, I mean, it's really simple. Like, people are going to tell the story for the next 30 years about how, can you believe people used to not halt puberty for
Right.
children until they could decide whether or not they wanted to go through surgery to have their genitals removed.
It's going to be
And they're
considered
going to,
like lobotomy and so forth, like
no, no,
overly.
no, very
Yeah.
far from it. It's going to be, you'll be seen as the backward, you'll be seen as a racist. You'll be seen as the guy who was
Oh,
holding the sign
yeah.
saying, not in my town, right? That's how they intend to move forward. That's how
Right.
they're going to try to paint people. And the question is, are people willing to use the state to stop this? Are people willing to say, no, you can't do this to kids, and I don't care what kind of popular pressure you try to put against me, I will stop this because it is evil. And the hope that everything you do is seen as progressive, that one day you will be vindicated naturally by history, is dangerous because you won't.
But
you
where
know
does
the,
their power come from? Why do they have so much latent currency throughout not just recent contemporary modern America, but just going back a broader, because this is a long time coming. I mean,
sure,
what's that driver that's pushing them? That's what I'm trying to get at.
it's
I think it's I think it's a parasitical imitation of Christianity moving us
oh
there.
yes.
And so my point is, here's my kind of overall critique, is like trying to roll back redemptive history back to a monarchy style response is kind of like it's not going to get, you have to kind of double down on the future and outcompete the left, not in cheap little appeals to political correctness. We're not talking about that, but truly double down on running to the aid of the vulnerable and having a whole cultural effused with that to get the culture to move towards repentance, which would then open up a space for sanity to come back for things like that. So my thought is, no, you can't roll back to, like, Constantine was a product of that period of redemptive history. That was the kind of thing that would come out and have success. But to go back artificially and say, let's go back to that, it's like kind of like missing out what has happened in terms of like deconstruction of power because of Christianity and its counterfeits that has happened since then. And
So I
media
would
as well. And media is important in this.
Oh, it is. And so I would look at, say, Rome is always our model. So we'll just go to that. The Romans get rid of the kings, right? They get rid of the kings and they become a republic. And over time, it starts with just the gens, only they can vote, and then eventually the plebs gain power inside and they have additional input into the democracy. And eventually, or the republic at that point, but eventually it does stretch to true democracy as the social wars bring in the Latins and all the others, and they gain citizenship. And pretty soon, the Senate realizes that the best thing it can do is basically just constantly extend this stuff, right? And so you end up in a scenario where eventually the social conflict inside the republic and then the democracy and what would have basically just become an oligarchy becomes so great that we end up with the Principate, right? We end up with the first citizen, Augustus. And what is Augustus? He's a king, right? He's not, no one calls him king. He doesn't take the title of emperor, but everybody knows that he has basically, dissolved the power of these democratic forces, and he's returned Rome to a monarchy. And the further you go down the emperors, the more they do this. The more that the Senate becomes a vestigial organ, and they never, it takes a while before they really start calling these people kings. But essentially, they not only become them kings, they end up being worshipped, right? And so I think that it's dangerous to say we've moved beyond this, that this is dissolved. I think these are truths of human nature. And I think that we live inside those. I don't think that Christ's truth is one that completely just determines our political structure for eternity. I don't think that's the purpose. I don't think that's why Christ came. And I don't think that it has completely undermined us. You're right. We'll probably never call what comes next a king, but it will be much like Augustus. No one will call them king.
It'll be a person, though. It'll be a person.
But they'll be a person, and they'll reorganize this, because I think humans fall into those patterns. We have not been freed of our human nature. God frees us of many other things, but He has not freed nations of the way in which they are ruled.
Mm-hmm. I think we have much to repent of in terms of the wicked wars and things that we've pursued. And until Christians truly repent of that stuff, they won't have any better future in terms of being able to have a nation with sanity in mind. If you've gone through decades and decades of wicked wars and you haven't fully accounted for it, you kind of did. You tried to a little bit with Trump, kind of like, yeah, I guess those were stupid wars, but you're not truly really taking like, what did we do? What have we doing? What are we doing? Meat grinding up all these people in Ukraine. What is going on? If you haven't truly had that repentance, I mean, your Christianity is not ready to take root in society, because you're not able to tell the truth. If you're not able to tell the truth, there's no place to be critiquing some kind of leftist woke thing. It's just not.
I mean, and you're certainly right about that, which is why I think that the fact that our country is still, even when the left is now in power, basically built on a perpetual war machine, which is why they needed to get into this Ukraine thing in the first place, kind of shows you that truth, right? Even when we've embraced what was supposed to be the anti-war side, which was supposed to be those who stood up against this stuff, what's the first thing they do? They prop the machine back up again and just continue where it started. So I think you're right that it would take repentance on both sides for that to make a difference.
Well, I really appreciate your time, Auron. It's always great talking to you, and I want to continue to encourage people to check out your work and at the Blaze, and your work online is very thought-provoking. So appreciate your work.
No, I appreciate it. It's a great conversation.
All right, take care.
Have a good one.